In a small Montana town, Sarah Mitchell, a young woman who lost her teeth in a tragic accident, faces constant rejection and humiliation when seeking employment. Her confidence shattered. She's turned away from job after job until she meets Jake Sullivan, a quiet cattle rancher who sees beyond her appearance. As their unlikely friendship develops into something deeper, Sarah must learn to heal not just her smile, but her wounded heart, while discovering that true acceptance comes from within. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Millbrook, Montana, as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her worn denim jacket and checked her reflection in the dusty window of Peterson's general store. Her auburn hair was neatly braided, her blue eyes bright with nervous hope. But when she caught sight of her mouth, she instinctively pressed her lips together in a tight line. The accident 2 years ago had taken more than just her teeth. It had stolen her confidence, her career as a receptionist, and what felt like her entire future. The bell above the door chimed as she entered the store, the familiar scent of wood polish and old leather greeting her. Mrs. Peterson, a stern woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, looked up from behind the counter where she was sorting through invoices. "Sarah, dear Mrs. Peterson said, her voice carrying that particular tone of pity that Sarah had grown to despise. "I heard you were looking for work." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "I saw your help wanted sign in the window. I have experience with customers, bookkeeping, and inventory management." Peterson's eyes flickered with something that might have been sympathy before hardening into business practicality. "Well, you know this is a customer-facing position. People come in here every day. Ranchers, families, tourists passing through. They expect a certain presentation." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she pressed on. "I'm very good with people, Mrs. Peterson. I've worked retail before and I understand the importance of customer service." "It's not about your skills, dear." Mrs. Peterson's voice grew gentler, which somehow made it worse. "It's about, well, you understand. When customers see, they might feel uncomfortable. It's not personal, you know. It's just business." The rejection hit Sarah like a physical blow. She nodded stiffly, mumbling a thank you before turning toward the door. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Peterson's heavy sigh, but it offered no comfort. Outside, the October wind cut through her jacket as she walked slowly down Main Street. The town seemed smaller than usual, the familiar buildings pressing in around her like disapproving faces. She passed the diner where she'd worked before the accident, its windows glowing warmly in the afternoon light. Through the glass, she could see waitresses moving between tables, their smiles bright and welcoming. Everything she felt she could never be again. The accident replayed in her mind as it did every day. The drunk driver running the red light, the impact that sent her car spinning into a telephone pole, the moment she'd woken up in the hospital, her jaw wired shut, to learn that the trauma had been so severe that her teeth couldn't be saved. The insurance settlement barely covered the medical bills, leaving no money for the expensive dental work she needed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister Emma, who lived in Seattle. "How did the interview go? Thinking of you." Sarah stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain that it hadn't even been a real interview? That she'd been dismissed before she could even properly state her qualifications? She slipped the phone back into her pocket without responding. The trailer park where she lived sat on the outskirts of town, a collection of aging mobile homes surrounded by a chain-link fence. Her neighbors were mostly elderly retirees on fixed incomes and single mothers struggling to make ends meet. It wasn't much, but it was all she could afford on her meager savings and the occasional odd job. As she approached her small trailer, she noticed smoke rising from the chimney of the unit next door. Old Mrs. Chen, a retired seamstress who'd immigrated from Taiwan decades ago, was probably making her afternoon tea. The elderly woman had been kind to Sarah, never seeming to notice or care about her missing teeth. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Chen called out from her tiny porch, waving a weathered hand. "How are you today?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Chen," Sarah replied, forcing a smile that she kept carefully closed-lipped. "You look tired, child. Come, I make you some tea." The kindness in the older woman's voice nearly broke Sarah's composure. "That's very kind, but I should probably—" "No excuses. You need tea and someone to talk to." Mrs. Chen stood up from her lawn chair with surprising agility for her 78 years. "I can see worry in your eyes." Sarah found herself following Mrs. Chen into the cramped but immaculately clean trailer. The walls were covered with photographs of grandchildren in Seattle and traditional Chinese paintings. The small kitchen table was set with delicate porcelain cups that seemed far too elegant for the humble surroundings. "You went looking for work today," Mrs. Chen said as she poured steaming jasmine tea. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sarah admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. The warmth felt good against her cold hands. And nothing. Same as always." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "I don't know what I'm going to do, Mrs. Chen. My savings are almost gone, and no one will hire me because of how I look." Mrs. Chen sat down across from her, her dark eyes studying Sarah's face with the intensity of someone who'd seen much of life's cruelty and beauty. "You know, in my country we have saying, 'A smile comes from the heart, not from the mouth.'" "That's beautiful," Sarah said, though she couldn't hide the skepticism in her voice. "But employers don't seem to see it that way." "Maybe you looking in wrong places," Mrs. Chen suggested. "Maybe you need to find people who see with their hearts, not just their eyes." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the tea warming Sarah from the inside out. Through the small window, she could see the sun beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "There's a farmer's market this weekend," Mrs. Chen said suddenly. "Maybe you should go. Not for work, but just to be around people. Sometimes opportunities come when we're not looking so hard." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she had the courage to face more potential rejection. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Chen pressed a small wrapped package into her hands. "What's this?" "Homemade cookies. For energy. You're going to need it." Back in her own trailer, Sarah unwrapped the cookies and found a note tucked inside. "Beauty is not in the face. Beauty is a light in the heart. Khalil Gibran." She sat on her second-hand couch, surrounded by the silence of her small home, and allowed herself to cry for the first time in weeks. The tears came in waves, grief for the life she'd lost, frustration at the constant rejections, and a deep, aching loneliness that seemed to grow stronger each day. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, Sarah looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. Without her usual careful guard, she could see the gap where her teeth should be, the way it changed the shape of her face. But for just a moment, she tried to see what Mrs. Chen saw, not the absence of teeth, but the presence of something else, something that couldn't be taken away by an accident or destroyed by other people's prejudices. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the wind rattling the windows of her trailer, Sarah made a decision. She would go to the farmer's market, not because she expected anything to change, but because staying hidden in her trailer wasn't living. It was just existing. And maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Chen was right. Maybe there were people in the world who could see past the surface to something deeper. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in months, Sarah fell asleep with something that might have been hope flickering in her chest, small and fragile but undeniably there. Outside, the Montana wind continued to blow across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of change and the possibility that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unexpected places. Saturday morning arrived with the crisp bite of autumn air and the first hint of frost on the trailer windows. Sarah stood before her small closet, hands trembling slightly as she debated what to wear. The farmer's market would be bustling with people, locals she'd grown up with, tourists passing through, vendors she'd known since childhood. The thought of facing them all made her stomach churn, but Mrs. Chen's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes opportunities come when we're not looking so hard. She settled on a soft gray sweater that brought out her eyes and her most comfortable jeans, paired with worn brown boots that had seen her through many Montana seasons. Before leaving, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and practiced her closed-lip smile, the one she'd perfected over the past 2 years. It looked almost natural now, though it felt like wearing a mask. The Millbrook Farmers Market took place every Saturday in the town square, a patch of grass surrounded by historic brick buildings that had stood since the 1800s. White canvas tents dotted the area, sheltering vendors selling everything from fresh produce to handmade crafts. The autumn air carried the scent of apple cider, pumpkin bread, and the earthy smell of root vegetables. Sarah walked slowly through the crowd, keeping her head down and her hands buried deep in her jacket pockets. She paused at Maria Rodriguez's flower stand, admiring the late-season blooms, hardy mums in burgundy and gold, the last of the sunflowers standing tall despite the cooling weather. "Sarah," Maria called out, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "It's so good to see you out and about." "How have you been, Mika?" Maria was one of the few people in town who still treated Sarah the same way she had before the accident. Her dark eyes sparkled with kindness, and her smile was as bright as the flowers surrounding her. "I'm doing well, thank you," Sarah replied, keeping her response brief and her lips barely parted. "You should come by the house sometime. Rosa misses you. She's always asking about her favorite babysitter." Maria's daughter Rosa was 8 now, but Sarah had watched her when she was younger, before everything changed. "I'd like that," Sarah said, though they both knew it was unlikely to happen. She distanced herself from most of her former life, unable to bear the mixture of pity and discomfort she saw in people's eyes. As she moved away from Maria's stand, Sarah nearly collided with a tall man carrying a wooden crate filled with pumpkins. He was wearing a faded denim shirt and well-worn jeans with work boots that had seen plenty of use. His brown hair was slightly mussed by the wind, and when he looked up, she found herself staring into the kindest green eyes she'd ever seen. "Oh, I'm sorry," she mumbled, stepping back quickly and bumping into a display of honey jars behind her. "No harm done," he said, his voice carrying a gentle drawl that spoke of long days outdoors and quiet evenings. He set down his crate and moved to steady the wobbling honey display. "Are you all right?" "Ooh," Sarah nodded, acutely aware of her tightly pressed lips and the way she was unconsciously angling her face away from him. "I'm fine, thank you." Something in his expression caught her attention, not pity or discomfort, but simple concern. He didn't seem to be studying her face or searching for flaws. Instead, he was looking directly into her eyes, as if that's where he expected to find whatever he needed to know about her. "I'm Jake Sullivan," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Don't think we've met properly, though I've seen you around town." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. His grip was firm but gentle, the hands of someone who worked with his hands but knew how to be careful with fragile things. "You're Mrs. Chen's neighbor, aren't you? She speaks very highly of you." Sarah felt a flutter of surprise. "You know Mrs. Chen? She mends my work shirts sometimes, best seamstress in 3 counties, and she makes incredible dumplings." Jake's mouth curved into a slight smile. "She mentioned she had a sweet neighbor who was going through a tough time." Heat rose in Sarah's cheeks. She hated being the object of pity, even from someone as kind as Mrs. Chen. "I should probably get going," she said, preparing to flee. "Wait," Jake said, his tone so gentle it stopped her in her tracks. "I was actually hoping to run into you. Mrs. Chen mentioned you might be looking for work, and I've been needing help with some bookkeeping and office organization. My ranch isn't exactly a corporation, but the paperwork seems to multiply on its own." Sarah stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity to see if we'd work well together," Jake corrected. "The pay's honest and you'd mostly be working with files and numbers rather than people, if that's what you prefer." The kindness in his voice was almost too much to bear. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back quickly. "You don't even know my qualifications. Mrs. Chen says you're smart, reliable, and trustworthy. That's worth more than any resume." Jake paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Look, I know we don't know each other well, but sometimes you have to take a chance on people, and sometimes people need someone to take a chance on them." Sarah stood frozen, part of her wanting to run away and part of her desperate to accept. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." Jake was quiet for a moment, his green eyes thoughtful. "My grandmother used to say that kindness is like a seed. It only grows if you plant it. Someone planted a lot of seeds for me when I was younger, and I guess I'm just trying to return the favor." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion erupted near the vegetable stands. A small child had knocked over a display of tomatoes, sending them rolling across the grass. The mother was frantically trying to gather them while apologizing profusely to the vendor, who was clearly frustrated. Without thinking, Sarah hurried over to help, dropping to her knees to collect the scattered tomatoes. Jake followed, and soon they were both working to salvage what they could. The little boy, no more than 4 years old, was crying with the dramatic despair that only small children can muster. "Hey there, buddy," Sarah said softly, crouching down to his level. "It's okay. Accidents happen." The child looked up at her with tear-streaked cheeks, and Sarah found herself smiling naturally for the first time in months. Not the careful, closed-lip smile she'd perfected, but a real smile that came from her heart. She didn't think about her missing teeth or how she looked. She was simply focused on comforting a scared little boy. "Are you hurt?" she asked gently. The boy shook his head, his sobs subsiding to sniffles. "I was trying to reach the big red one for Mommy." "Well, that was very sweet of you," Sarah said. "Should we help find some good tomatoes for your mom?" As they worked together to select the best tomatoes from the scattered pile, Sarah felt Jake's eyes on her. When she glanced up, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. something between admiration and recognition. "Thank you so much," the mother said, her relief evident. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." As they walked away from the vendor's stand, Jake was unusually quiet. Finally he spoke. "You're a natural with kids." "I used to babysit a lot," Sarah replied, the warmth from the encounter still lingering. "Mrs. Chen was right about you," Jake said. "You do have a beautiful smile." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her mouth, and she felt the familiar shame creeping back. "I don't think I saw it," Jake interrupted gently. "Just now with that little boy. It wasn't about your teeth, Sarah. It was about your heart." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, weaving between the market stalls. Sarah felt something shifting inside her, a small crack in the wall she'd built around herself. "The job offer," she said suddenly. "Is it still available?" Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. "Are you interested?" Sarah took a deep breath, tasting the autumn air and feeling the sun on her face. "Yes, I think I am." "Good," Jake said, and his smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Can you start Monday? I'll pick you up at 8. No sense in you having to drive all the way out to the ranch until you're sure you want to stick around." As they exchanged phone numbers and made arrangements, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope she'd carried to job interviews, but something stronger and more sustainable. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there were people in the world who could see past the surface to something deeper. The farmers' market was winding down as they said goodbye. Vendors packing up their unsold goods and families heading home with their weekly bounty. Sarah walked slowly back to her trailer, her mind replaying the morning's events. Jake's kindness felt too good to be true, and part of her waited for the other shoe to drop. But as she unlocked her trailer door, she found Mrs. Chen waiting on her porch with a knowing smile. "How was the market?" the older woman asked. "Different than I expected," Sarah admitted. Mrs. Chen's eyes twinkled. "Sometimes the best things come when we're not looking for them." As Sarah settled into her trailer that evening, she allowed herself to imagine what Monday might bring. For the first time in months, the future felt like something to anticipate rather than endure. Monday morning arrived with a sky the color of pewter, heavy clouds promising the first snow of the season. Sarah stood at her trailer window, watching for Jake's truck while nervously adjusting her navy blue blouse for the 3rd time. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling between excitement and terror about her first day of work in over 2 years. At exactly 8 o'clock, a dusty red pickup truck pulled into the trailer park. Jake emerged wearing a clean flannel shirt and jeans, his brown hair still damp from a morning shower. He walked to her door with the unhurried gait of someone accustomed to physical work, and when he knocked, his smile was warm and reassuring. "Ready for your first day?" he asked as she locked her trailer behind her. "As ready as I'll ever be," Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The drive to the Sullivan Ranch took them through 15 miles of Montana countryside, past rolling hills dotted with cattle and fence lines that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Jake kept up a comfortable stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area's history. Sarah found herself relaxing despite her nerves, charmed by his easy manner and the genuine pride he took in his land. "My grandfather started this ranch in 1947, Jake explained, as they turned down a gravel road flanked by weathered wooden posts. "He came back from the war with nothing but determination and a dream of raising cattle. My father expanded the operation, and now it's my turn to figure out what comes next." The ranch buildings appeared gradually as they crested a small hill, a modest 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a large red barn that had been recently painted, and several outbuildings scattered across the property. Everything looked well maintained but lived in, the kind of place where function mattered more than form. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, and meant it. There was something peaceful about the way the buildings sat in harmony with the landscape, as if they'd grown naturally from the earth itself. Jake parked near the house and led her up the porch steps. "The office is in here," he said, opening the front door. "I converted what used to be my grandmother's sewing room, figured it made more sense to keep the business stuff separate from the living areas." The farmhouse interior was comfortable and masculine, with leather furniture and wood paneling that spoke of 3 generations of Sullivan men. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, and Sarah glimpsed images of Jake as a boy, standing proudly beside prize-winning cattle at county fairs. The office was a disaster. Papers covered every surface, filing cabinets overflowed with documents, and invoices were scattered across a desk that hadn't seen its surface in months. Sarah stared at the chaos, feeling overwhelmed. "I know it looks bad," Jake said, rubbing the back of his neck sheepishly. "I'm better with cattle than I am with paperwork. My grandmother used to handle all this, and after she passed 5 years ago, I just let it get away from me." Sarah walked slowly around the room, taking inventory of the mess. Despite the disorganization, she could see that Jake was meticulous in his record-keeping. He just didn't have a system for organizing it all. "How do you find anything?" "Usually I don't," Jake admitted with a rueful laugh. "Last month I spent 3 hours looking for a receipt that was taped to the back of a feed bill. That's when I knew I needed help." Something about his honesty touched Sarah. He wasn't trying to impress her or pretend he had everything under control. He was simply showing her exactly what he needed and trusting her to help solve it. "Where would you like me to start?" she asked. Jake's relief was palpable. "Wherever you think makes the most sense. I'll be out checking on the cattle, but I'll be back around lunchtime. If you need anything, just holler." After he left, Sarah stood in the middle of the chaotic office and took a deep breath. For the first time in 2 years, she felt truly useful. This wasn't about her appearance or her ability to charm customers. This was about her skills, her mind, her capacity to bring order to chaos. She started by clearing the desk, sorting papers into basic categories: invoices, receipts, correspondence, and veterinary records. As she worked, she began to understand the rhythm of ranch life through the documents: feed bills that spiked during harsh winters, veterinary expenses that told stories of difficult births and sick animals, equipment repairs that spoke of Jake's determination to keep everything running smoothly. By mid-morning, she'd created a basic filing system and was beginning to enter data into a simple spreadsheet on Jake's ancient computer. The work was methodical and satisfying, requiring the kind of focused attention that kept her mind from wandering to darker thoughts. Around 11, she heard the sound of boots on the porch. Jake appeared in the doorway, his hair mussed and his shirt dusty from morning chores. "How's it going?" he asked, then stopped short when he saw the transformation. The desk was clear, papers were neatly stacked in labeled piles, and Sarah had created a basic organizational system that made sense. "I hope this is okay," Sarah said, suddenly worried that she'd overstepped. "I can change anything you don't like." "Are you kidding? This is amazing." Jake walked around the desk, examining her work with obvious appreciation. "I can actually see the surface again." Sarah felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with her capabilities. "I found some interesting patterns in your expenses. Would you like me to show you?" They spent the next hour going through her preliminary analysis. Sarah had identified several areas where the ranch might save money, and she'd noticed that certain expenses seemed to spike at predictable times of year. Jake listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes. "You really know what you're doing," he said finally. "I feel like I've been running this place half-blind for years." "You've been running it with your heart," Sarah replied. "That's more important than spreadsheets. I'm just helping you see the numbers behind what you already know." Something in Jake's expression shifted, and Sarah realized she'd been speaking naturally, without the careful control she usually maintained. She'd been so focused on the work that she'd forgotten to be self-conscious. "I should probably get back to this," she said, suddenly aware of herself again. "Actually, I was hoping you'd join me for lunch," Jake said. "I made sandwiches this morning, and I'd like to show you around the property if you're interested." Sarah hesitated. Working alone in the office felt safe, but spending social time with Jake felt more vulnerable. "I don't want to impose on your day." "You're not imposing. You're helping me save my ranch from drowning in paperwork. The least I can do is feed you." They ate lunch on the porch, thick ham sandwiches and hot coffee from a thermos. Jake told her about the different herds, the seasonal rhythms of ranch life, and his plans for expanding the operation. Sarah found herself asking questions and offering observations, drawn into his world despite her usual reserve. "What made you want to be a rancher?" she asked as they watched a group of cattle grazing in the distance. Jake was quiet for a moment, his green eyes thoughtful. "I tried college for a couple of years, studied business in Bozeman, but I kept feeling like I was supposed to be somewhere else. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant to be its steward." "That's a big responsibility." "It is," Jake agreed, "but it's also a privilege. Every morning I wake up and know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Not everyone gets that kind of clarity." Sarah envied him that certainty. She'd thought she knew what she wanted before the accident, but now she felt adrift, uncertain about everything except her desire to disappear. After lunch, Jake gave her a tour of the property. They walked through the barn, where he introduced her to his favorite horse, a gentle mare named Sweet Pea. They visited the cattle, and Jake explained how he rotated the herds to keep the grassland healthy. He showed her the equipment shed, the feed storage areas, and the small vegetable garden his grandmother had planted that he still maintained. She believed that a ranch should be able to feed itself, Jake explained, as they walked between rows of winter squash and root vegetables. Said it kept you humble to remember that everything comes from the earth. As they walked back toward the house, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, not just to a place, but to a purpose. The work was meaningful. Jake was kind without being patronizing, and for the first time since the accident, she felt like she was contributing something valuable to the world. "Jake," she said as they reached the porch, "thank you for giving me this chance." "Thank you for taking it," he replied. "I have a feeling you're going to save this place." As they returned to the office for the afternoon, Sarah caught her reflection in the window. She looked different somehow, not physically, but in the way she carried herself. There was something in her posture that spoke of purpose, of dignity restored. The afternoon flew by as she continued organizing files and entering data. Jake worked nearby, cleaning equipment and planning the next day's tasks. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, occasionally asking each other questions or sharing observations about the ranch's operations. As 5 o'clock approached, Sarah realized she didn't want the day to end. The work had given her something she'd forgotten she possessed, a sense of competence and worth that had nothing to do with her appearance. "Ready to head back?" Jake asked, appearing in the doorway with his keys. "Actually," Sarah said, surprising herself with her boldness, "would it be possible for me to stay a little longer? I'd like to finish entering this month's feed bills." Jake's smile was brighter than the afternoon sun. "Stay as long as you like. I'll be doing evening chores anyway." As Jake headed out to tend to the cattle, Sarah settled back into her work with a contentment she hadn't felt in years. Outside the window, the Montana sky was beginning to show hints of the sunset to come, and somewhere in the distance she could hear Jake's voice calling to the cattle as he brought them in for the evening. For the first time since the accident, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 3 weeks into her new routine, Sarah had transformed not just Jake's office, but her own sense of purpose. The chaotic room had become a model of organization, with color-coded filing systems, updated computer records, and a monthly budget that actually made sense. More importantly, she'd begun to feel like herself again, competent, valued, and necessary. The November morning was crisp and clear as Jake picked her up for work, frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Sarah noticed he'd been quieter than usual during the drive, his hands gripping the steering wheel with unusual tension. "Everything okay?" she asked as they pulled into the ranch. Jake parked near the house and turned to face her, his green eyes troubled. "I got a call from the bank yesterday. They want to meet next week about the loan extension." Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd been working with the ranch's finances long enough to understand what this meant. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," Jake admitted. "The drought last summer hit us harder than I thought, and beef prices have been down. I've been juggling payments for months, but I'm running out of options." They walked to the office in silence, both lost in thought. Sarah immediately pulled up the financial records she'd been meticulously organizing, her mind racing through possibilities. The numbers painted a stark picture. The ranch was bleeding money, and without a miracle, Jake might lose everything his family had built. "What if we could show them a solid plan for profitability?" Sarah suggested, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "I've been tracking some patterns in your expenses and revenue. There might be opportunities we haven't explored." Jake leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen, and Sarah caught the familiar scent of his cologne, mixed with the clean smell of hay and autumn air. "What kind of opportunities?" "Well, look at this," Sarah said, pulling up a spreadsheet. "Your highest profit margins come from the organic grass-fed beef you sell to that restaurant in Bozeman. What if we could expand that market?" "I've thought about it, but I don't have the connections or the marketing know-how." "But I might," Sarah said, her excitement growing. "Before the accident, I worked in customer service and sales. I understand how to present a product, how to build relationships with clients. What if we developed a direct-to-consumer program?" Jake stared at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "You think it could work?" "I think it's worth exploring. We have 3 days before your meeting with the bank. Let me put together a presentation." They spent the morning researching local restaurants, farmers markets, and specialty food stores. Sarah made phone calls with a confidence she hadn't felt in years, her professional skills returning like muscle memory. Jake provided the technical knowledge about the cattle and the land, while Sarah crafted the marketing strategy. Around noon, Jake's neighbor, Tom Bradley, stopped by. Sarah had met him briefly during her first week, a gruff man in his 60s who owned the adjacent property. He knocked on the office door, his weathered face creased with concern. "Jake, I heard about your trouble with the bank," Tom said without preamble. "Thought you should know that Hartwell Development has been sniffing around my place too. They're looking to buy up ranch land for some kind of resort development." Jake's jaw tightened. "They approached me last month, offered well above market value." "I'm not selling," Tom said firmly. "This land has been in my family for 40 years, but I wanted you to know. If you're thinking about it, I understand. Sometimes a man's got to make hard choices." After Tom left, the office felt heavy with unspoken tension. Sarah watched Jake stare out the window at his cattle, his shoulders rigid with the weight of decision. "You could sell," she said quietly. "It would solve your financial problems and destroy everything my grandfather built," Jake replied. "He didn't survive the Depression and fight in a war just so I could sell out to developers the first time things got tough." Sarah felt a surge of admiration for his integrity, even as she worried about the impossible situation he faced. "Then we make this plan work. We find a way to save the ranch." That afternoon, they drove to Bozeman to meet with Marcus Weber, the chef who'd been buying Jake's organic beef. The restaurant was elegant but unpretentious, with exposed brick walls and the kind of atmosphere that spoke of quality ingredients and careful preparation. Marcus was a thin man in his 40s with prematurely gray hair and eyes that lit up when he talked about food. He greeted Jake warmly and listened with interest as Sarah explained their proposal for expanded distribution. "The demand is definitely there," Marcus said, cutting into a sample of Jake's beef. "Farm to table is more than a trend now. It's what consumers expect. But you'd need to guarantee consistent quality and reliable delivery." "We can do that," Sarah said confidently. "Jake's operation is small enough to maintain strict quality control, and we're proposing a subscription model that would give customers regular deliveries of seasonal selections." They spent 2 hours developing the concept, with Marcus providing insights into the restaurant industry and potential contacts. By the time they left, Sarah had a notebook full of ideas and a growing sense that they might actually be able to save the ranch. The drive back to Millbrook was quiet, both of them processing the day's events. As they passed through the familiar landscape, Sarah realized how much this place had come to mean to her. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a life, a future, a chance to be part of something meaningful. "Sarah," Jake said suddenly, "I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "If we do this, if we expand the business, it would mean longer hours, more responsibility, probably some travel to meet with potential clients. Are you ready for that?" Sarah thought about the question seriously. 6 months ago, the idea of traveling to meet clients would have terrified her. The thought of presenting herself to strangers, of having to smile and make small talk, would have sent her into a panic. But something had changed during her time at the ranch. She'd rediscovered her professional confidence, her ability to connect with people through shared work and common goals. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Jake pulled into the ranch yard as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Instead of heading straight to the house, he parked near the barn and turned to face her. "I have something to say, and I hope you'll hear me out," he began, his voice unusually serious. "When I hired you, I thought I was just getting help with paperwork. But you've become so much more than that. You've brought ideas and energy and hope to this place. You've made me remember why I love what I do." Sarah felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away. "The ranch has given me something too. Purpose. A reason to get up in the morning." "Sarah, Jake started, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "I hope you know that your value here has nothing to do with how you look. You're brilliant and creative and kind. You have a gift for seeing possibilities where others see problems." Tears stung Sarah's eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. "Thank you. That means more than you know." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Sarah felt a connection to this man that went beyond their professional relationship, but she was afraid to examine it too closely. The thought of risking this fragile peace, this sense of belonging, was terrifying. "We should probably get you home," Jake said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As they drove back to town, Sarah found herself thinking about the future in a way she hadn't since the accident. Not just surviving from day to day, but actually planning and hoping and dreaming. The ranch had given her back her sense of purpose, but Jake had given her something even more precious, the belief that she was worth knowing, worth trusting, worth caring about. Back at her trailer, Mrs. Chen was waiting on her porch with a cup of tea and a knowing smile. "You look different," the older woman observed as Sarah approached. "Happy? I am happy," Sarah admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. And the rancher, he is good to you." Sarah thought about Jake's kindness, his respect for her abilities, the way he looked at her as if she were the most competent person in the world. "He's a good man, Mrs. Chen. A very good man." "Good men are rare," Mrs. Chen said sagely. "When you find one, you hold on tight." As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to save the ranch, to build something lasting and meaningful with Jake. The dream felt both impossible and inevitable, like a star that's always been there, but you're just now learning to see. Outside her window, the Montana wind whispered through the trailer park, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the promise of challenges ahead. But for the first time in years, Sarah wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. She was ready to fight for the life she was building one day at a time. The morning of the bank meeting arrived with a biting wind that rattled the windows of Sarah's trailer and sent dried leaves skittering across the ground like nervous thoughts. She stood before her small mirror, adjusting the navy blazer she'd borrowed from Mrs. Chen, the only professional outfit that came close to fitting her slight frame. Her hands trembled as she applied a thin layer of lip balm, the closest thing to makeup she'd worn since the accident. Jake arrived precisely at 7:30, wearing a pressed white shirt and his best pair of jeans. His usually tousled hair was neatly combed, and Sarah could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. They'd spent the past 3 days preparing their presentation, working late into the evenings by the light of the kitchen table, but both knew that everything they'd built together hung in the balance of the next few hours. "Ready?" he asked, though his voice carried the weight of someone who wasn't sure if anyone could ever be ready for such a moment. "As ready as we'll ever be," Sarah replied, gathering the carefully organized folders and the laptop computer they'd borrowed from the library. Her stomach churned with familiar anxiety, but underneath it ran a current of determination she hadn't felt in years. The First National Bank of Millbrook occupied a stately brick building on Main Street, its brass nameplate gleaming despite the overcast morning. As they climbed the steps, Sarah caught sight of their reflection in the glass doors, two people who looked far more confident than they felt, carrying the hopes of 3 generations of Sullivan ranchers. Robert Martinez, the loan officer, was a man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patient demeanor of someone who'd delivered both good news and heartbreak countless times. His office was decorated with photographs of Montana landscapes and a small collection of ceramic horses that spoke of his own connection to the land. "Jake, good to see you," Robert said, shaking hands warmly before turning to Sarah with polite curiosity. "And you must be Sarah Mitchell. I've heard good things about the work you've been doing at the ranch." Sarah felt a flush of surprise. Word traveled fast in small towns, but she hadn't realized her efforts had been noticed beyond the ranch boundaries. "Thank you, Mr. Martinez. We're hoping to show you some exciting possibilities for the Sullivan Ranch." They settled around the conference table, and Sarah opened her laptop with hands that were steadier than she'd expected. The presentation they'd crafted was comprehensive, but accessible, filled with charts and projections that told the story of a ranch ready to evolve without losing its soul. "The Sullivan Ranch has been operating at a loss primarily due to external market factors," Sarah began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But our analysis shows significant opportunities for diversification and direct-to-consumer sales that could dramatically improve profitability." She clicked through slides showing beef price trends, competitor analysis, and demographic data about consumers seeking locally sourced organic meat. Jake provided context about the ranch's operations, explaining their sustainable practices and the superior quality of their grass-fed cattle. "The key insight," Sarah continued, "is that consumers are willing to pay premium prices for transparency and quality. By developing direct relationships with customers through farmers markets, CSA programs, and online sales, we can capture significantly higher margins than selling through traditional commodity markets." Robert leaned forward, studying the financial projections with growing interest. "These numbers look promising, but what about implementation? Moving from bulk commodity sales to direct-to-consumer requires significant changes in operations." This was where Sarah's research shone. She'd spent hours on the phone with other ranchers who'd made similar transitions, learning about everything from processing regulations to delivery logistics. "We've identified 3 local processors who can handle our volume, and we've already secured commitments from 5 restaurants in Bozeman for regular purchases." The initial investment would be modest, primarily marketing materials and a delivery vehicle. Jake produced letters from Marcus Weber and other potential clients, his quiet pride evident as he watched Sarah field questions with expertise that impressed even him. She'd transformed from the hesitant woman he'd met at the farmer's market into a confident professional, advocating passionately for their shared future. "What about the seasonal nature of the business?" Robert asked. "Cattle ranching has always been subject to weather and market fluctuations. That's actually one of our strengths," Sarah replied, clicking to a slide showing year-round revenue streams. "By processing and freezing beef during peak seasons, we can maintain consistent delivery schedules. We're also proposing value-added products, jerky, sausages, prepared meals, that command higher prices and have longer shelf lives." As the presentation continued, Sarah felt herself settling into a rhythm she remembered from her previous career. This was what she'd been good at before the accident, seeing possibilities, building relationships, solving problems through creativity and persistence. The skills had never left her. They'd simply been buried under layers of shame and fear. "The bottom line," Jake said, taking over for the final portion, "is that we're not asking you to take a bigger risk. We're asking you to invest in a more sustainable future. This plan doesn't just help us pay back the loan, it positions the ranch for long-term growth." Robert closed the folder and removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. "I have to say this is one of the most thorough business proposals I've seen from a local operation. You've clearly done your homework." Sarah felt her heart racing as she waited for the verdict. Beside her, Jake's hand rested on the table, his knuckles white with tension. "I'm going to recommend approval for the loan extension," Robert continued, "with the caveat that we'll want to see quarterly reports on your progress implementing this plan. The bank has an interest in seeing local businesses succeed, especially operations with the kind of community roots the Sullivan Ranch represents." The relief that washed over Sarah was so intense, she felt dizzy. Jake's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in weeks, and for a moment, the weight of 3 generations seemed to lift from his shoulders. "There is one more thing," Robert added, his expression growing serious. "I understand Hartwell Development has been making offers to ranchers in your area. I want you to know that this loan extension is based on your commitment to maintaining the ranch as a working agricultural operation. Any sale to developers would trigger immediate repayment of the full balance." Jake nodded firmly. "The Sullivan Ranch isn't going anywhere, Mr. Martinez. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and if we have anything to say about it, it'll be here for 3 more. As they walked out of the bank into the crisp November air, Sarah felt as if she were floating. They'd done it. They'd actually convinced the bank to give the ranch another chance. More than that, they'd created a plan that could genuinely transform Jake's operation from a struggling commodity business into a thriving specialty operation. "I can't believe we pulled that off," Jake said, stopping on the sidewalk and turning to face her. "Sarah, what you did in there, that was incredible. You were incredible." "We did it together," Sarah replied, though she couldn't suppress the glow of pride at his words. "Your knowledge of the ranch operations, your relationships with the community, none of this would have worked without that foundation." They drove back to the ranch in comfortable silence, both processing the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. As they turned into the familiar gravel driveway, Sarah realized that this place had become more than just a workplace. It was home in a way her trailer had never been. "So what happens now?" she asked as they parked near the house. "Now we get to work," Jake said, his green eyes bright with possibility. "We have a business to build." They spent the afternoon calling potential customers and setting up meetings for the following week. Sarah felt energized by each conversation, her natural enthusiasm for the project shining through in every call. Jake watched her work with an expression that made her cheeks warm, a mixture of admiration and something deeper that she didn't dare name. As evening approached, Jake suggested they celebrate with dinner at the local diner. Sarah's immediate instinct was to decline. Public restaurants still felt challenging, filled with potential stares and uncomfortable moments. But something had shifted during the bank presentation. She'd remembered who she was beyond her appearance, and that person wasn't afraid of a simple dinner. Murphy's Diner was exactly what Sarah expected. Red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and the comforting smell of hamburgers and coffee. The elderly waitress, Betty, knew Jake by name and greeted Sarah with warm curiosity rather than the pity she'd grown to expect. "Heard you two saved the Sullivan Ranch today," Betty said as she poured their coffee. "That's wonderful news. This town needs more success stories. Word really did travel fast in Millbrook. Sarah found herself smiling genuinely as Betty recounted the gossip network that had already spread news of their bank meeting throughout the community. For the first time since moving to the trailer park, she felt like part of the town rather than someone hiding on its edges. Over dinner, they talked about their plans for the ranch, the challenges ahead, and the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. Jake told her more stories about his grandmother, the woman who'd managed the ranch finances for 40 years, with nothing but a ledger book and fierce determination. "She would have liked you," Jake said as they shared a slice of apple pie. "She always said that the best business decisions come from the heart as much as the head." As they prepared to leave, Sarah caught her reflection in the diner window. She looked different, not physically, but in the way she carried herself. The woman staring back at her was someone she'd thought was lost forever, confident, capable, and worthy of respect. The drive back to her trailer was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of shared accomplishment rather than awkward tension. When Jake walked her to her door, they stood for a moment under the porch light, neither quite ready for the day to end. "Thank you," Jake said finally, "for everything, for believing in the ranch, for believing in me." "Thank you for giving me a chance," Sarah replied, "for seeing something in me that I'd forgotten was there." For a moment, they stood close enough that Sarah could see the gold flecks in Jake's green eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his presence. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, but neither moved to close the distance. "I'll see you tomorrow," Jake said finally, his voice soft with unspoken emotion. As Sarah watched his taillights disappear down the road, she realized that everything had changed. Not just her circumstances, but her sense of what was possible. For the first time since the accident, she wasn't just surviving, she was building something beautiful. Spring arrived at the Sullivan Ranch with a burst of wildflowers and the sound of new calves calling to their mothers. Sarah stood on the porch of the farmhouse, her farmhouse now, watching Jake work with the cattle in the distance. 6 months had passed since the bank meeting, and their direct-to-consumer business had exceeded every projection. The morning sun caught the engagement ring on her finger, a simple band that had belonged to Jake's grandmother. The proposal had come naturally, on a quiet evening in February, as they worked side by side in the office that had become the heart of their growing business. "Sarah," Jake called from the pasture, waving his hat in the air. "Come see this." She walked across the grass, her steps light with the kind of happiness she'd never thought possible. Jake stood beside a black Angus cow with her hours-old calf, both healthy and strong. "First birth of the season," Jake said, wrapping his arm around her waist. "Grandmother always said new calves were a sign of good fortune." Sarah leaned into his embrace, marveling at how natural it felt to be touched, to be loved exactly as she was. "I think your grandmother was right about a lot of things." Their wedding was planned for June, a simple ceremony in the ranch's meadow, with the whole town invited. Mrs. Chen had insisted on making Sarah's dress, and Marcus Weber was catering the reception with beef from their own cattle. "I have something for you," Jake said, reaching into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a small wrapped package, an early wedding gift. Sarah opened it carefully, revealing a delicate silver locket. Inside was a tiny photograph, not of her face but of her hands as she worked at the computer, completely absorbed in solving a problem for the ranch. "This is how I see you," Jake said softly. "Not hiding, not afraid, but creating something beautiful with your mind and your heart." Tears filled Sarah's eyes, tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Jake, You smile with your heart, Sarah Mitchell," he interrupted gently, echoing the words that had changed her life. "You always have. It just took time for the rest of the world to catch up." As they walked back toward the house hand in hand, Sarah thought about Mrs. Chen's wisdom, about the journey from that first rejection at Peterson's store to this moment of complete acceptance. She'd learned that healing wasn't about fixing what was broken, it was about discovering what had always been whole. The Sullivan Ranch thrived not just as a business, but as a symbol of what was possible when people saw beyond the surface to the heart beneath. And Sarah had finally learned the most important lesson of all. True beauty wasn't about having perfect teeth or a flawless smile. It was about having the courage to love and be loved, exactly as you are. The future stretched ahead of them like the Montana sky, vast, bright, and full of infinite possibility.